They said Moses cooked like angels, that his hands turned cassava flour into bread that smelled of heaven, and that his broths could cure even bitterness. That's why they bought him. That's why they locked him in the kitchen of Casa Mendoza, in the heart of Havana, where marble gleamed beneath oil lamps and small bells announced every whim of the master. No one imagined that those same hands, blessed with patience, would feed the slowest vengeance that city had ever known. The story began one August afternoon, when the whip fell across Clara's back in the courtyard. She was 12. Her crime, dropping a porcelain teacup imported from Sevilla. Don Rafael Mendoza ordered 15 lashes. Moses watched from the kitchen window, his hands submerged in dishwater, as the overseer's leather carved red lines into skin that had never known violence. Clara didn't scream. She bit her lip until blood ran down her chin, her eyes fixed on the fountain where goldfish circled in oblivious loops. That night, Moses ground the shards of that broken teacup into powder finer than salt. He stored it in a tin box that once held cinnamon, and he began to plan. Not with rage. Rage was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. With arithmetic. With the cold certainty of a man who understood that justice, like cooking, required precision, timing, and an unflinching hand. The house Mendoza had walls that listened, floors that remembered every footstep, and a kitchen where Moses ruled over fire, blade, and hunger, the only kingdom a slave could claim. Chapter 1. The architecture of patience. Moses had been property for 19 years. He remembered his mother's face as a blur of warmth, nothing more. The plantation where he learned to cook had taught him other lessons too, that obedience bought survival, that silence was armor, and that the powerful never looked closely at what they consumed. Food was beneath their attention, until it wasn't there. Casa Mendoza sat 3 blocks from the harbor, close enough that the smell of salt and tar seeped through shuttered windows. The house had 17 rooms, a chapel with imported stained glass, and a kitchen built like a dungeon. Stone walls, iron hooks for hanging meat, a floor that sloped toward a drain where blood and grease disappeared into Havana's underground. Moses worked alone. The other slaves, Clara, who cleaned, Tomas, who tended horses, old Josefa, who mended linens, were forbidden from entering. Don Rafael insisted his meals be prepared in solitude. Privacy, he called it. Moses understood it was control. The morning after Clara's whipping, Moses crushed the porcelain between 2 grinding stones used for maize. The powder settled like snow across the stone surface. He swept it into the cinnamon tin and slid it behind a loose brick near the hearth. His hands didn't shake. Years of scaling fish and deboning chickens had steadied them beyond fear. Don Rafael ate breakfast at 7 each morning. Bread, chocolate, and sliced mango. Doña Inez, his wife, took hers at 8 in the bedroom. Café con leche with sweet biscuits. Their son, Rodrigo, 19 and cruel in the thoughtless way of young men born to power, ate whenever he pleased, usually standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Moses work with eyes that assessed value like livestock. That first morning, Moses added 1 pinch of ground glass to Don Rafael's chocolate. Not enough to taste, not enough to kill, just enough to scratch. By midday, Don Rafael complained of stomach pain. By evening he was irritable, snapping at servants, clutching his abdomen. The family physician, a Spaniard who smelled of tobacco and declared everything humors, prescribed rest and chamomile tea. Moses prepared the tea. With another pinch. Clara found him that night in the kitchen, long after the house had gone dark. She moved like smoke between shadows, her back still bandaged with cloth strips Josefa had soaked in plantain water. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Moses didn't look up from the mortar where he ground tomorrow's breakfast. "Cooking." "I saw you," she said. "The tin, the powder." He stopped. The kitchen held its breath, only the crack of palm oil cooling in the pan, the distant bark of street dogs. "Then you saw nothing," Moses said quietly. Clara stepped closer. In the candlelight, her face showed the map of 12 years lived in service. Old eyes and young skin, fear and fury braided together. "I want to help." Moses studied her. Help meant complicity. Complicity meant death if discovered. But it also meant he wasn't alone. "Watch the courtyard during meals," he finally said. "If anyone comes toward the kitchen, ring the bell twice. Say you're calling me for Doña Inez." Clara nodded once and disappeared back into shadow. Moses returned to his work. The powder mixed into masa for tomorrow's bread. Invisible, patient, arithmetic. Chapter 2. The Language of Symptoms. 3 weeks passed like water through fingers. Don Rafael's illness became routine. He woke with stomach cramps, spent mornings doubled over a chamber pot, rallied by afternoon, then weakened again by evening. The physician visited twice weekly, prescribed various tinctures, none of which helped, because Moses controlled what entered the Don's body. Every meal, every drink carried the invisible weight of Clara's whipping. Doña Inez began to suffer too. She developed mouth sores that wouldn't heal, complained of a burning throat, refused solid food. Moses adjusted his portions, less for her, more for Don Rafael. The powder worked differently in different bodies. Hers was frailer, required precision. His was robust, built on decades of excess, needed persistence. Rodrigo remained untouched. Moses needed someone healthy to deflect suspicion, and the young master ate irregularly, often taking meals at the taverns near the port. Besides, Rodrigo hadn't ordered Clara's punishment. He was guilty only of inheritance, of blindness, crimes Moses deemed insufficient for glass. The household began to hollow out. Don Rafael stopped attending Sunday Mass. Doña Inez no longer hosted her weekly salons where Havana's elite women gossiped over imported wine. The house grew quiet, heavy with sickness, and the unanswered question that haunted the physician. What disease strikes only 2 people in one household? Perhaps the water, the doctor suggested, examining samples in vials. Or miasma from the harbor. Moses served him coffee with perfect courtesy. No powder. The doctor needed to stay healthy, stay confused. In the kitchen, evidence accumulated behind the loose brick. The cinnamon tin, now half empty. A folded paper where Moses marked doses and scratches only he understood. A second tin, begun when the first ran low, filled with ground glass from a shattered mirror Rodrigo had smashed in anger. Clara proved invaluable. She reported conversations overheard while dusting, warned when the physician arrived unexpectedly, and once, when the overseer grew suspicious of Moses spending too long grinding spices, created a distraction by dropping a silver tray in the dining room. "They're saying Don Rafael might die," Clara whispered one night, bringing Moses water from the well. "Men like him don't die from stomach ailments," Moses replied, stirring a pot of black bean stew. "They die from God's will, accidents or age, never from their cook." But he knew the truth was more complicated. The glass didn't kill directly. It abraded, inflamed, weakened. It made the body attack itself. Don Rafael was dying from 1,000 invisible cuts, each one delivered by Moses's steady hand, each one punishment for Clara's 15 lashes. "How long?" Clara asked. Moses added ground glass to Don Rafael's portion of stew, a generous pinch now, as the Don's symptoms worsened and his suspicions remained dormant. "Until it's done." Chapter 3. The Physician's Doubt. By the 7th week, Don Rafael couldn't leave his bed. His skin had taken on a grayish tint, his eyes sunk deep into sockets rimmed with purple shadow. He shit blood into chamber pots that slaves carried out in silence, and his breath came shallow and fast, like a man drowning on dry land. The physician brought a colleague from Spain, a specialist in tropical diseases who examined the patient with growing confusion. They tested the water. They inspected the mattresses for vermin. They bled Don Rafael twice, which only weakened him further. Moses observed from the doorway, delivering meals on silver trays, broths enriched with glass, breads laced with vengeance. Doña Inez had stopped eating entirely. She survived on diluted wine and fear, convinced the house was cursed. She summoned a priest who blessed every room with holy water and incense, who prayed over Don Rafael's wasting body, and declared the illness a test of faith. Moses added powder to the communion wine. The household staff whispered theories. Old Josefa believed in witchcraft. Someone had purchased a curse from the santeros who practiced in the alleys. Tomas thought it was poison from a business rival. Don Rafael had made enemies in his sugar ventures. Clara said nothing, but Moses felt her watching him during meals, her face unreadable. One afternoon, as Moses prepared chicken and almond sauce, Rodrigo entered the kitchen. He stood too close, invasion disguised as curiosity. "My father is dying," Rodrigo said flatly. Moses kept his eyes on the cutting board. "I pray for his recovery every night, young master. The doctors find nothing. The priest finds nothing." Rodrigo picked up a knife, examined its edge. Makes a man wonder if something closer to home might be responsible. The kitchen held its breath. In the courtyard, a bell rang twice. Clara's warning. "Doña Inés calls for you," Moses said calmly. "She wants her afternoon tea adjusted." Rodrigo set down the knife with deliberate slowness. "You've been with this family 9 years, Moses." 10, young master. Then you understand what happens to slaves who betray their masters." Moses finally looked up, met Rodrigo's gaze with the blank deference he'd perfected over 2 decades. "I understand many things, young master, including that chicken and almond sauce requires attention or it burns." Rodrigo held the stare a moment longer, then left. Moses's hands didn't shake as he returned to his work, but his heart hammered against his ribs. Suspicion had arrived. Now came the dangerous part. Not the killing, but the endurance. The waiting for death while appearing desperate for life. That night, he added an extra portion to Don Rafael's broth. If you're still watching, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and how this story found you. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Suspicion. The physician's colleague left Havana convinced he'd witnessed a medical mystery, worthy of documentation in European journals. Don Rafael's condition worsened despite every intervention. His gums bled. His hair fell out in clumps. He vomited blood that stained the imported linens Josefa washed in secret, crying as she scrubbed. Rodrigo took control of the household. He inventoried the medicines, interrogated the physician, and began watching Moses with hunter's eyes. The kitchen became a stage where every gesture carried weight. Moses moved with exaggerated care, tasting every dish before sending it upstairs, maintaining the charade of a loyal servant desperate to prove his innocence. "Let me prepare the meals," Clara suggested one evening, her voice tight with fear. "They suspect you." "If I stop cooking, that confirms their suspicion," Moses replied, grinding glass from a broken wine bottle. "We're committed now. Forward is the only direction." But he knew the net was tightening. Rodrigo had started testing food on one of the yard dogs, a mastiff that ate Don Rafael's leftovers and remained healthy. The glass worked too slowly on animals, or perhaps the dog's simpler digestion processed it differently. Either way, the test proved nothing, which was its own danger. Then Doña Inés died. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Josefa found her still in bed, eyes open but empty, a trickle of blood dried at the corner of her mouth. She'd been eating so little that even small doses accumulated, concentrated, destroyed. Moses hadn't intended to kill her. She was collateral, punishment for proximity to Rafael's crime, but intention meant nothing to the dead. The house erupted. The physician demanded an autopsy. The priest performed last rites. Rodrigo shut himself in his father's room for 3 hours, emerging with eyes red and a jaw set like iron. "No more," he announced to the assembled slaves in the courtyard. Moses, Clara, Tomas, Josefa, the stable boy, the washwoman, all of them lined up like prisoners. "Someone in this house is responsible. Someone is poisoning this family." The overseer stood behind him, whip coiled in his hand. "The kitchen will be locked," Rodrigo continued. "Moses will prepare no more meals. We'll bring food from outside until my father recovers, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Moses felt Clara tense beside him but kept his own face still as marble. That night, locked in the slave quarters behind the main house, Clara whispered through the darkness. "What now?" Moses stared at the ceiling where palmetto bugs skittered across beams. Now we wait. For what? For Don Raphael to die from what's already inside him. The glass doesn't vanish. It's lodged in his gut, his throat, his stomach. Even without new doses, it will finish the work. And if he survives? Moses closed his eyes. Then we pray he has amnesia. But they both knew Raphael would remember, would hunt, would hang them from the ceiba tree in the plaza as examples. 3 days passed. Moses wasn't allowed in the kitchen. Meals arrived from a tavern near the port, bland, oversalted, the food of men who cooked for money, not revenge. Don Raphael ate without Moses's invisible additions and seemed to stabilize. The bleeding slowed. His color improved marginally. Rodrigo's suspicion began to shift elsewhere. Perhaps it had been the water after all. Perhaps Doña Inés had been the fragile one, and Don Raphael's illness would pass. The household exhaled cautiously. Then on the 4th night, Don Raphael's screams woke every soul in the house. Chapter 5. The Testimony of Glass. The physician arrived to find Don Raphael convulsing, vomiting blood that splattered the white walls of his bedroom. The grinding had done its work. Weeks of accumulated glass had shredded his intestines beyond repair. The body's attempt to heal only drove fragments deeper, and now, without fresh doses to mask the progression, the damage revealed itself all at once. Internal bleeding, the physician said gravely. His organs are failing. Rodrigo demanded answers that medicine couldn't provide. He stood in his dying father's room while slaves changed blood-soaked sheets, and something in his face had changed, grief calcifying into rage. Don Raphael died at dawn. His last words whispered to Rodrigo were, "The food, Moses." They came for him at sunrise. The overseer and 2 men from the city guard carrying iron shackles. Moses was in the slave quarters, sitting calmly on his cot as if he'd been expecting them. Clara stood at the door, her face pale, but he shook his head slightly. "Stay silent." "Moses, slave of Casa Mendoza," the guard announced. "You're charged with the murder of Don Rafael Mendoza and Doña Inés Mendoza by means of poison." Moses stood without resistance. As they shackled his wrists, Rodrigo appeared in the doorway. "Search his quarters," he ordered. "Find the poison." They tore apart the small room, overturned the cot, emptied the single trunk, scattered his few possessions, found nothing. The kitchen was next. They pried up floorboards, emptied sacks of rice and flour, examined every pot and pan. The overseer found the loose brick. Behind it, the cinnamon tin, nearly empty. The folded paper with its cryptic scratches. A second tin still half full of powder that glittered like salt in the morning light. "What is this?" Rodrigo demanded, holding up the tin. Moses met his eyes. "Spice." "Liar." Rodrigo opened the tin, poured a pinch into his palm. The powder caught the light, showed tiny sharp edges under close examination. "What is it?" "Taste it," Moses said quietly. "If you dare." Rodrigo's hand trembled with fury. He wanted to force Moses to eat it, prove his guilt through demonstration, but something stopped him. Perhaps the certainty that whatever filled that tin had killed his parents. Perhaps the recognition that Moses had already won. The trial lasted one afternoon. Moses was brought before a magistrate in chains, with Rodrigo presenting evidence: the tin of glass, the pattern of illness, the testimony of physicians. Moses spoke only once, when asked if he had anything to say in his defense. "Don Raphael ordered 15 lashes for a child who broke a cup," Moses said. "I returned the favor, one fragment at a time." The courtroom fell silent. "That is your confession?" the magistrate asked. "That is my testimony. Verdict, guilty. Sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out in the Plaza de Armas as a warning to all slaves who might harbor thoughts of rebellion." Clara stood in the crowd that gathered for the execution, tears streaming down her face. Josefa held her hand. Tomas looked at his feet. The other slaves of Havana watched with expressions that revealed nothing and everything. Chapter 6. The Price of Glass. They hanged Moses on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after Don Rafael's death. The scaffold stood in the plaza's center, beneath the ceiba tree where African spirits were said to gather. Moses walked to his death with the same steady patience he'd brought to cooking. No struggle, no pleas, just the arithmetic of consequence meeting action. Rodrigo watched from a balcony across the plaza. He'd inherited everything: the house, the slaves, his father's sugar interests, and the haunting question of how a man could commit murder for 3 months while servants watched and no one saw. Casa Mendoza would never feel clean again. Every meal would carry suspicion. Every servant would be a potential poisoner. The noose tightened. Moses's eyes found Clara in the crowd. He nodded once. Permission to survive. Absolution for living when he couldn't. The trapdoor opened. What Havana remembered was this: a slave named Moses who ground justice finer than glass, who fed it to his masters with the same care they'd fed him degradation, and who walked to death as if he'd simply finished a meal. The city whispered his name for decades, part warning, part admiration, always with the uneasy recognition that every master sat at a table where invisible hands prepared their food. Clara lived 40 more years. She was sold to a family in Santiago, survived to see her grandchildren free, and told Moses' story to anyone who would listen. Not as horror, but as testament that patience could be vengeance, that the powerless had power, that justice, like cooking, required only the right ingredients, the right timing, and a willingness to pay the price. The Casa Mendoza stood empty for 2 years before Rodrigo sold it. No one wanted to live in the house where slaves had won. In a city built on sugar and suffering, they still say, beware the quiet cook. His hands know how to season more than food. If this story kept you holding your breath, hit like. It helps us bring more forgotten histories back to life. Vengeance extracted from silence and served across 17 weeks leaves no victors, only witnesses, scars, and the stubborn memory that even the powerless can architect justice from fragments. Subscribe for more true-to-life tales of defiance, endurance, and the quiet justice history tried to bury.